Hello, and welcome to CrossTalk, a conversation series at the intersection of art and science. My name is Will Orwig. I'm a member of the digital curator team here for the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity. And what we aim to do with these talks is bring together artists and academics to explore questions of creativity. Today, we are joined by Alexa Miller and Paul Seli. Alexa is an expert in observation. She's a leading voice for the observation and inquiry practices in medicine. She's the founder of Arts Practica, a consultancy firm which offers arts-based workshops to promote safety in medical diagnosis. She has developed curriculum on this topic, including a course at Harvard Medical School titled Training the Eye, Improving the Art of Physical Diagnosis. Joining her in conversation is Paul Seli, professor of psychology at Duke University and leading researcher on the topic of mind wandering. He runs the Mind at Large Lab, which conducts research into how the experience of mind wandering can, at times, serve beneficial functions that facilitate creativity. Paul is also an accomplished visual artist specializing in oil painting. So without further ado, I am very excited to introduce our guests and kick off the discussion. So hello to Paul and Alexa.
Hello. I don't know if my video has come up. I don't see myself. Am I present?
I cannot see you.
I can't.
I can hear you.
Oh, well, that's good.
What's
Hey,
behind
Paul.
the curtain?
Paul, for some reason, I can't turn your video on if you want to go ahead and do that yourself. Sorry about that.
No worries. How do I go about doing this? I've not used this program much.
If you hover over, yep, there you go.
Oh, okay, cool. Sweet. So, hello. So Alexa and I, just for everyone listening, we met briefly last week, and we started to, I think this is going to be somewhat informal and I think more fun as a consequence of that. But we started chatting last week, and it got to the point where we just started to really dive into topics that we both wanted to save for this discussion for everyone else. So I'm really stoked to get into that. I guess to start, I know a bit about what you do, Alexa, but maybe not everybody here does. So, you deal with uncertainty with physicians diagnosing different conditions, and you've got this love for art, and you've branched these two together to help decrease uncertainty and increase the diagnostic process. So maybe if you could tell me and everybody listening a bit about that process.
Sure. So it's been sort of an unexpected and certainly an unfinished journey, but my training is as a visual artist. And as part of that experience, like making art and training and painting, I realized I had a sort of gut level discomfort with the way in which uncertainty was not recognized in medicine, and the way in which the limits of medical perception were not recognized. And that had to do with some experiences in my family where I sort of viscerally lived the harm and the danger of that. And so it was unexpected, but it was as an artist that I got really interested in uncertainty in medicine and the medical learning process. And I also was coming to it from a place of like real love of the human body and then human adaptability and resilience. So I got into the space of art and medicine as an artist. And then I had a very lucky break early on in my career. I was in Boston and I was teaching in an art museum, and I was like making art and doing a bunch of different things. But I met a group from Harvard Medical School, a group of faculty who were, they themselves were artists. And they were concerned about what they were observing with residents on the wards, which was a lack of confidence in simply like being present with patients, that they noticed spiking as more and more technology was coming into the clinic. This was like almost 20 years ago. And so they were really keen to develop observation skills and in-person physical examination skills with students and residents. And they saw already the connection with arts experiences to do that. So I got to get in on the development of that course. And of course, because it was Harvard Medical School, the curriculum board was very skeptical, and they said we could only proceed if we assessed if that was successful. So we did that. We ran a 2-year longitudinal study, and we actually found stunning results that the students who took our class made a lot more observations on clinical pictures than those who didn't. And so that was sort of how it all got started. And then I've been extremely lucky. I sort of came into this right at the time that a lot of medical schools and schools of nursing, dentistry, social work were beginning to make more and more use of art museums in their curriculum. So I've been able to work at a bunch of different sites and as a consultant and faculty trainer to help develop curriculum around that. And through that time, I've also continued to study uncertainty in medicine and the challenge of it, as well as the value of it, and to study and promote in my teaching like the most adaptive strategies for managing and communicating about uncertainty. And art has remained a really core part of the methodology because art's experiences in and of themselves are uncertain ones, and they're very low risk uncertainty where a lot of creativity and learning and collaboration can happen. So there's more to say about that, but that's kind of the nutshell.
Yeah, totally. So I guess two things come to mind. One is I think with art, at least, I find that the uncertainty for me at first, so as Will said, I do oil paintings more regularly as time goes on. I remember the first canvas I bought, big canvas I bought, was 3x4 foot. And I was terrified, not being certain of what I might paint on it. The canvas costs $150 plus a couple $100 of oils. And so, it doesn't tie into diagnosing anybody, but certainly growing as an artist has really been accompanied by a decrease in uncertainty in myself and what I can do, and not worrying about the price of the paintings or, what it cost me, and just sort of going with it. Yeah. So the other thing, I guess, what's that?
It's a risk, and you have to be confident and bold, and also be willing to give over to what's going to happen.
Totally. Yeah. So what does the if I were a participant in one of these, assuming I was a physician and I was a participant in one of these workshops, what would I do? What's the artistic skill that helps increase?
So, I mean, I do workshops on a range of topics. So what we might do might vary based on if we were. So I also do a lot with just basic observation, which I believe is kind of one of a number of, but one really foundational adaptive skill and strategy for adapting and co-creating health with patients in uncertainty, and really striving towards accuracy, really accurately seeing another person. And so I guess I'll talk about that, but I also do a little bit of work with bias awareness, and more I'm working on issues around the distortions and the blind spots of the white gaze in medicine. And I also do stuff with pre-medical students on uncertainty and their expectations. So sort of how I work will vary. But if we were doing like just a basic observation, and if it was not the pandemic and we could be in an art museum together, I would start with some basic like didactics about the topic, and then we'd go right into drawing in the galleries. If it was a group of us, I'd have us first kind of wander around, probably in pairs and small groups, and find some unexpected things and have some new kinds of conversations to kind of get people warmed up. And then we would embark on like a slow looking process with a work of art that is, going to be by nature selected for its ambiguity and its complexity, and also maybe different kinds of topics or issues it might trigger. And it often is a painting, but it could be a sculpture is wonderful. Especially if in the space of the museum, we can go to different sides of it. And I really love to have groups engage in observation in a range of different ways. So, and then to track how their thinking might change over time as they know it and see it through different ways. So I'll have them first actually track their very first initial gut reactions, just like first 3 words that come to mind. Then we'll do a little bit of drawing. And when you draw, you're sort of forced to take in the whole picture and you might look at it more systematically and methodically than you would if you were just like sort of strolling by. And then to talk about it in a group in a way that really optimizes the perspectives of others and the diversity within the group. So I use a process called visual thinking strategies, which is a method for facilitating discussions of works of art that was authored by Abigail Hausen, who's a cognitive psychologist who studied aesthetic development, or what we think about when we look at art, and Philip Yenowine, who's a really celebrated art educator who's great at conversations that matter with people with art. And so visual thinking strategies is a big thing. It happens in schools all over the world. I know there are people with us in this session today who do it really well, who study it. So I bring that in, and it one of the things that I find, I find a lot of things very powerful about it, in that it asks a group to really slow down and focus, and you can get really immersed in a flow state of like total focus, of like being all up in this work of art and each other's perspectives. And there's a certain layer of shared mind, like people seeing what others see and having like a shared concept of what you're looking at. And then there's also a major cycle of like independent thought going, and both of those things are going on simultaneously. And then following that, I will have them write again to say, what do you think is happening in this work of art? And then they have a comparison of like their gut reaction and then their opinion about an hour later after engaging with the work in different ways. And they can see what of their gut reaction, stayed, and what of that footprint stayed, and then what significantly changed. And we can identify some of the factors that might have changed their mind. Oh, it was when somebody noticed this detail over here, or it was when somebody, brought in this totally different perspective that I would have never thought about. So it gives a little feedback as to their own thinking, and also just a really visceral reminder of like what it actually takes to really slow down and start to see something at all, because doctors are so rushed. It's often taken for granted, the complexity and the sort of energy and the work of unbiased seeing. It's not easy. So, and then, so that's kind of the basis of it. And then we might do other things, but that's kind of the bedrock.
Cool. So am I right in assuming that after this sort of workshop that these physicians become better, like objectively better at diagnosing certain conditions? Does it help them with that?
I would love to say that. I don't have research on that. I have assessments that say they intend to make some changes in their practice, like solicit second opinions more, to actually recognize moments of uncertainty and say, hang on, I'm in uncertainty, and invite the patient in different ways. So there's a whole list of actually like concrete actions and sort of clinical moves that clinicians can take in uncertainty. There's things like teach back strategies and ways of adapting to it. And so I teach some of those ways. I call them looking with uncertainty. So I've studied a lot how really masterful diagnosticians approach uncertainty. And it's quite different from the standard fare norms, what you see in healthcare frequently, where uncertainty is like, they really excellent clinicians, like they don't react to uncertainty at all. They respond to it. They leverage it as a space for learning and looking again, like you would look at a work of art with a friend. And so there's a whole literature in clinical teaching, sort of breaking down some of these moves. And there's also, I've learned a lot from artists. I myself am an artist, and I have a lot of friends who are artists, and art is a big part of my life. And I also really observe the way artists approach the world and their work and moments of fear. And it's actually quite different culturally than how that's approached in medicine. So I teach those things, and I I ask participants to report back on those things, but I actually have yet to figure out a way to actually track like diagnostic success, which would certainly be like the gold standard. So if you have any thoughts on that, or if anybody with us has thoughts on that or wants to partner on a study, I'd be really interested.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the thing that immediately comes to mind is, you know, you have a between subjects experiment where one group undergoes this, you know, takes place in or experiences this workshop. The other group has something sort of similar, a control group where they're not, you know, learning about art appraisals and the ambiguity in it, but something, I don't know what exactly the control would be, and then do a follow-up, you know, some weeks later to see, you know, are they actually better able to diagnose conditions? It also, so like, you know, I've recently started to get into the creativity research, which I love and have been waiting to get into forever. But I'm sure many of the listeners today actually know a lot more about the literature than I do. I've got my own experiences with painting and just, you know, love it. But I had to, I suppose, pick a horse and ride it so that I was an expert for a job talk. But in any case, I guess, well, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Well, I actually have some questions for you because I think like one of the things, you know, when you look at, there are people like, there are a number of really excellent scholars who study uncertainty in medicine. I actually just had the privilege of interacting with one of them earlier this week, Dr. Paul Hahn, who's a senior scientist at the National Cancer Institute. And he's developed a whole taxonomy of how we can understand uncertainty in medicine so that we can have a shared concept of it and understand its challenges as well as some of its values. And in its issues and like where the uncertainty resides in different cases. Is it, you know, on the patient side or the clinician side? There's actually a lot of evidence that like people's attitude, patients' attitudes towards uncertainty actually can help their outcomes. So there's a whole world there. But when I teach a class at Brandeis on medical uncertainty, and he led one of our class on Tuesday, and he presented his model, and he ended with a slide on, you know, the strategies needed in medicine, and they were things like openness and humility and creativity.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at your work, and you do a range of things, you know, from looking at dreams and mind wandering, and also intellectual humility. And
so
I think
it's amazing that you say this. That's the thought that I lost, was the research. Like I guess I do too many lines of research and then I got all muddled up in them. But yeah, it sounds like what you're doing would actually be a really neat manipulation to use for an intellectual humility study. And for anyone listening who's not aware of intellectual humility, it's really, I mean, it's a fuzzy construct, as are most, but the general idea is an understanding, acknowledgement that you don't know everything, and that this is associated with a host of benefits. But yeah, having people view artwork, which is ambiguous, I think could really instill a sense of humility in people, where you're certain of, you know, your interpretation of a given piece, but then you come to realize that other agents are seeing things differently. And yeah, I could see in diagnostic terms, you know, looking at physicians, this would be the case, that you might be quite confident in your appraisal of somebody's condition, but then, you know, you talk to another qualified person and they see it completely differently. So it might give you pause, which would lead you to be more analytic and perhaps come up with a better diagnostic. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot I want to ask you about intellectual humility and like what it looks like in the brain, and how you got interested in it. But I will say to what you just said, it's exactly right. And I think that, you know, doctors, they're under incredible pressure, and their jobs are just getting harder and harder and harder. And, you know, when you look at like the burnout rates and the suicide rates, like every doctor I know is seriously considering leaving medicine, is sad about having lost a colleague to suicide, is like going through a lot with risking their own life and their family's health with COVID is like sad, because they used to be a creative writer and they put it all aside for medical school, and like they feel really crushed by a lot of the operational factors, and just, you know, the time crunch in the clinic is just getting more and more and more is being asked of them. And, you know, these are really good people who like want to see their patients and want to observe and want to listen and are under enormous pressure. But that said, the humility piece is certainly an issue, and it, you know, the culture around the education is a big piece of that. But one of the things that I think there's an incredible opportunity with art is that to recognize like you don't know everything in art is like extremely pleasurable. You know, it's like revelatory, and it can change your worldview and just kind of give you these incredible aha moments. Like, I mean, that's why I do the work I do, is every time I talk about a work of art with a group, I see something new and I learn about it, and it in ways I just wouldn't, you know, especially with artists like who I know a lot about. I see things with beginner viewers that like I just would never think, and I love it. And so I think there's this opportunity to like contribute an actual like embodied feeling of joy with the humility that in the context of medicine like is extremely stressful. Like your competence is on the line, your reputation is on the line, someone's patient, you know, your patient is on the line, a lot of money is on the line. So I think that's one of the biggest opportunities of it.
Yeah, along those lines, one thing I found quite interesting, I mean, I primarily do abstract art, is that oftentimes the observer, friends of mine, for example, who are at my place, will see things in there that they assume I did intentionally, and make a whole story out of it. And they're kind of co-creating the piece in a sense, right? Where it's like, oh shit, I see that. Like, I didn't mean for that, but it really is quite dynamic and interactive. Yeah.
I mean, isn't that just makes art so wonderful, that it's like this active communication that takes others to unlock, and there's all this decision making that goes into it, and some of it's conscious, some of it's not, and some of it's just not intentional at all, but it's still there. And that's how it like lives out in the world. And it's so fun. That's great.
Yeah.
So all right, so let's talk about your work a little bit. Tell me about, why don't we start with intellectual humility? I'd love to hear more about it and how you study it and how you got interested in it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as far as measuring it, there's a host of different scales that will assess intellectual humility, most of which correlate with each other, but there's some divergence, some predict certain things, others don't. But you essentially just ask people for self-reports on their own humility, the extent to which they're willing to acknowledge that they don't know everything, that they're open to opponents' perspectives, not necessarily that they endorse them, which I think is important. You know, you could be intellectually humble and listen to, you know, an ideological or political opponent. It doesn't mean you have to endorse their perspectives, or, you know, but really, I guess it was, you know, I'm a Canadian who came to the States right when Trump got into power, and there was, you know, I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time, and lots of my friends weren't happy about that, and there was a lot of derogation going on toward other people. And, you know, I've got my own political views, but I thought it was quite sad to see people treating each other so poorly over something that we don't really understand altogether well. And so the idea was to essentially try to get people to be kinder to each other and less likely to derogate each other. And I guess it all was born out of my experiences as an undergrad and grad student, where I certainly wasn't looking for this, but just by chance, and the odds of this are astronomically low, that my advisors were both conservatives and Christians, which in academia you almost never find. I think it's like 5% tops. Again, I wasn't looking for that. I'm an atheist, and I'm libertarian, I suppose, if anything. But I got to know them as people, and they're incredibly bright and thoughtful and considerate, and they challenged my way of thinking by talking about things that I was raised to not believe in, and would provide good arguments, not necessarily sufficiently compelling for me to change my perspective, but enough to say, holy shit, like this person has really thought this through. And so I had these experiences where I got to know the people and got to become friends with them and appreciate them. And then, these contentious topics, potentially contentious topics, were brought up. But to me, at this point, it didn't matter. Now, today, especially with COVID, we've got people on Twitter or on Instagram or Facebook who have, share a view. And if you disagree with that view, you derogate that person, not you, but, this happens a lot. And then there's just this hostility when I could have seen myself if, for example, I knew that my advisors were both Christian conservatives and I knew nothing more about them, maybe I wouldn't have joined their labs, but it would have been a terrible mistake. Like I had such a wonderful upbringing in academia with them. So really the big picture here is trying to increase humility, mostly thus far along the political divide, to get conservatives to be less likely to derogate liberals and vice versa, and to just get people to be more cooperative. Again, not to endorse each other's perspectives, but to listen to each other. And we've had some limited success with that, getting people to cooperate, for example, before they know each other's ideological positions seems to help, where now people are more receptive to listening to the other person, again, not endorsing their argument. They're more likely to friend them on social media, a host of really, I think, beneficial things where it's essentially bringing humans together who would otherwise be at each other's throats.
So do you actually bring them together in the lab, or how do you do this?
Yeah, so thus far we've not brought them together because most of this work has started around the time that COVID hit. But we are running a study right now where they're meeting through Zoom, so face to face they'll see each other and are collaborating on projects there. Otherwise, what we've done, and this isn't published yet, but we'll have them complete a study in which they think they're collaborating with somebody, but it's really just a computer. And then at the end, you tell them that they're of the opposite political side of the spectrum, and then you get them to make these judgments versus a case wherein they don't collaborate with these people whatsoever. Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Wow, thanks.
Wow. Yeah. No, it just reminded me of when I was a camp counselor and kids were fighting, and we would send them into the woods and tell them to put up a tent together.
Yeah. In fact, there's a brilliant ad by Heineken you can find on YouTube that actually sparked this idea. They've got a number of ideological opponents, essentially people who have different views on anything from being transgendered to being politically right versus left, and these people don't realize at the beginning that they're actually opponents. And they're asked to build something together. They're not sure what, but it requires both of them, sort of like an IKEA setup where somebody has to hold something. Yeah. And so they do this, and at the end, it's also clever from an advertising point of view. They end up building a corner of a bar, and then there are two Heinekens sitting there, the two bottles of Heineken sitting there. And then this TV screen drops down, and they're shown each other's perspectives on these things. So, for example, there's a trans woman and a man who is transphobic, and it shows the trans woman talking about her transition, and then it shows the man talking about how he's transphobic, and they just spent an hour cooperating and building something, and then it says at the end, you have the option to just leave, or you can sit and talk about your differences. And I don't know if they actually did this, if they had actors, I'm not sure, but it was nevertheless compelling, and the people, at least who they showed, stuck around and talked about their differences. And it was just this case of humility where it's shit, you think you know something and you know a person, but actually getting to know them before you pass judgment based on something that's relatively trivial, I think is really important. So that's my desire for the humility research. Yeah.
I love it. And can you actually see that neurologically, in their brain, something different happening?
I've not done any sort of fMRI or EEG studies on it. It's an interesting question whether you could show differential brain activity as a function of whether people become more receptive and less likely to derogate others or not. But I just don't know. I don't have the data. And the literature on intellectual humility is relatively new. It's not been around that long, so there's not a ton of research on it, which for anyone listening, grad students or postdocs, is a great thing to jump onto when it's a new field, because there's just so much low-hanging fruit. And this one has a good potential cause. So, yeah.
Cool. I just wanted to jump in with a question from the audience that's gotten a few upvotes. So this is to either one of you. To what extent can artwork contribute to knowledge? And are artworks with a certain amount of uncertainty or complexity necessary to bring forth new perspectives?
Knowledge. I don't know. I'm such a stick in the mud for semantics. Yeah. I guess I'm not sure if this is a direct answer to the question, but just my experience with it and painting and whatnot. It's sort of Freudian without being like too psychodynamic, because I do like science. But I feel like it's a way for me to communicate things that are, I suppose, in some sense subconscious, or at least certainly not something that I'm actively, explicitly thinking about. And the way to achieve that for me is to sort of let go, to surrender to the experience, not be self-critical, not be judgmental. And it's almost dissociative insofar as I end up painting something that it feels like I didn't paint in a sense, like the controlling egocentric me didn't do it. And so I think there's some knowledge to be gained there from whatever it is in me that actually created the piece. And then I can kind of learn about myself. I don't know that, that I buy into Rorschach tests, for example, because they don't seem to be valid. And maybe one could make the same argument here, but it does seem to be some sort of knowledge, at least even if it's idiosyncratic or a case study. I learn about myself through the process.
So I would agree with that. And I think that Paul is talking about there's a lot of different aspects of art and knowledge, and he's talking about the art making aspect. And I would almost characterize what he's saying as like a form of research. And you're like learning about yourself and also learning about things beyond yourself, and certainly like the skills of it. And I think, and I would totally agree with that. I also think that encountering art and viewing art, there are a few layers of how that might contribute to knowledge as well. So certainly, art really generally broadly defined, like we could be talking about, photographs from a specific place that might give you cultural knowledge and help you learn about things that you had never seen before, or humanize things, but also or something totally different, like a really contemporary sculpture might give you different kinds of knowledge about different themes or issues that it's interacting with. I think there's certainly knowledge to be gained about materials and also how artists see the world. I mean, artists make art for all kinds of reasons, right? Like to document things, to respond to things, to have an experience of beauty or flow, or to have a critical response to something, and all of those different sort of expressions, I think can lead to a different form of knowledge. And there's a lot out there about what knowledge actually is. And I think it was Richard Feynman, the physicist, who said experience is the authoritative knowledge. And so when we interact with art, we get not only the knowledge in a cerebral way of what it's representing and picturing, but we have knowledge in our being, in our body, as if we were having a conversation with it about whatever those issues are. And I think that there's a whole layer of experiential knowledge and the capacities around that as well.
I don't know if we're waiting on Will to throw another question at us.
I got plenty of questions for you guys.
Okay.
One thing I actually wanted to touch on that was mentioned by Alexa was about these aha moments, and that's something that's been described extensively in creative literature. And I'm wondering how that fits into both your experience of art observation and of medical diagnosis. And do you find that these aha moments are common in masterful diagnosticians?
That's a great question. Aha moments in masterful diagnosis. I think, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, or just, in people who are really great at diagnosing, do they have these moments?
Everybody who's really great at diagnosis and who teaches about it says almost the same thing, is that the patient in front of you is the key to your success. And it's simply hearing their story, asking the right questions, getting them to say something that makes you go, oh, wait a minute. I'd say that's like an extremely common theme that I hear among masterful diagnosticians. I even know an emergency room physician who will carry around like a little bedside ultrasound and do ultrasound on patients, not to actually get the ultrasound, but to have an excuse to be like, we're just stopping and hanging out for a minute. Because it's like in that space of putting the thing on and just being like, hang on, we have to wait for the picture to come up. Someone's going to like chit chat. That's often like when they'll get the detail that clues them in.
I guess I would ask the same of Paul too, in terms of mind wandering and your approach to art. How does the aha moment factor in?
Yeah, so a good friend of mine, Jonathan Schooler, he's a prof at UC Santa Barbara and started the field of mind wandering alongside Johnny Smallwood. He did a study, an experience sampling study, where people would download an app on their cell phone and then respond to thought probes throughout the day intermittently that would ask them, were you just focused on whatever you were trying to do or not? And he found that so you can think of an aha moment as overcoming an impasse, right? Like there's some problem that you're trying to solve and you just can't, and then you all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, I know I got the answer now. I think it was 75% of the resolutions to these impasses occurred during some sort of explicit focus where people were trying to solve the problem. But 25% occurred when people were essentially mind wandering. They weren't attending to anything. They were in the shower or they were jogging or something along these lines. And if I've got it correctly, when they overcame those impasses through mind wandering, they felt even more important. And so it does seem to be the case that at least sometimes not actively focusing your attention on something can be beneficial. And I mean, it makes sense. We mind wander a hell of a lot. All of us, almost all of us do, if not all of us. There's one would think some evolutionary reason behind it. And it does seem to allow some sort of processing of information that's not explicit. It's tacit or implicit. And then later, something somehow, we don't know, but bubbles up to the point where it reaches consciousness and you say, oh shit, that's the thing. Like that's the solution to this problem. Yeah.
I was going to say, Paul, if you wouldn't mind commenting a little bit on the perceptual decoupling, which is thought to be involved in this mind wandering, and how that factors into the process.
Sure. I don't know if it factors into the aha. Well, yeah, I don't know if it factors into the aha thing. This is Johnny Smallwood's term, perceptual decoupling. Again, something we've all experienced, and then you have to demonstrate it scientifically, otherwise it's just hearsay. The idea is that when you're mind wandering, when you're thinking internally about something unrelated to your external experience, you get this decoupling or detachment from your external world. So even though your eyes might be open and light is hitting your retina, that information is not being processed as deeply as it would if your attention were focused on it rather than your internal dialogue or your internal thoughts. And Johnny and colleagues have shown this where they've done EEG studies. So they'll look at electrical activity in the brain, essentially when people are mind wandering, when they're not, and show that there's a dampening of the processing of external information in cases where people are mind wandering. Again, I don't know how to directly tie it into overcoming impasses or the aha moment, except that, people, at least the 25% of time when people are mind wandering and they do have this experience of overcoming an impasse, they're not coupled to the environment. But mechanistically, I don't know what's going on.
Is that like when somebody's just like really, you can tell like they're just far away?
Yeah. So yeah, we actually ran that study when I was doing my grad studies to see whether people actually could tell based on like 5-second clips of people who later, like, I'd record you for an hour and then say, intermittently, were you just mind wandering the 5 seconds before?
Yeah.
And then I'd get cases wherein you said you were, and then cases wherein you said you weren't. And I would show participants roughly 50-50 of these and say, do you think Alexa was mind wandering or not? And it seems that people aren't very accurate at this, not above chance in guessing that. So, which is interesting in its own right, that we have this sense that we know when people are zoned out, but certainly, at least based on that experiment that we ran, we don't in fact know that. Nonetheless, the experience I think that we all have is where our eyes are open. For anyone who's driven and gone three stops past where there was their exit, right? Your eyes are open. You're perceiving everything. The stimuli are coming in, but you're perceptually decoupled. You're not looking at that stuff, and it's amazing that we can do this automatically. But yeah,
I do that all the time.
Yeah, you're not alone.
Another question for Alexa. This comes from David Riebersdorf. Have you looked at whether the different medical specialties differ in their humility regarding their expertise?
I haven't looked at humility, but now I'm really interested to study humility. There are a lot of studies on tolerance of ambiguity in medicine, and they do vary by specialty. So like tolerance of ambiguity is much higher, for example, in pediatricians, where like the patient is not always necessarily going to be able to talk, or things vary so widely with children. You have to be okay with a certain amount of ambiguity to like be successful as a pediatrician. Same with family medicine, psychiatry, a lot of the more like sort of medical territories that are much more subjective. You do see higher tolerance of ambiguity there than with like urology. It's probably like the lowest, or cardio, thoracic surgery is going to be very low tolerance of ambiguity. It's really it's quite interesting. There is a wide medicine has so many different different areas.
So one other thing I was sort of mulling over, thinking about mind wandering and uncertainties, this question about constraints. And if we think about mind wandering as being a very unconstrained form of thought, whereas direct observation, or sort of careful observation that's involved in diagnosis, would be highly constrained. And then in relation to creativity, there seems to be these component processes that we like, when we're creative, we like being very open and unconstrained, and also at times really focusing and having a very specific goal. So I open it up to both of you about what this relationship might be in terms of these fluctuations between more constrained versus less constrained thought, and how they both contribute to creative thinking.
Yeah. Well, I'll take a stab at it. Certainly, at least from the perspective of painting, it rings a bell for me, where I should take a video of myself painting one time. I'll go up to the canvas, I'll do a thing, and then I'll go sit there. I've got a lawn, like a camping chair set up, because I'm going back and forth. I'm switching between this free-flowing state of do whatever, and then going back and observing. So it's going, speaking of, in terms of the brain, probably something like default mode activity, of just being more spontaneous, to frontal parietal regions and engaging in some sort of executive control and judgment over what I've done. And I've noticed over the years, I do that more frequently. Last night I was painting, and it was just like every 30 seconds or maybe even less than that. So it seems to be this embodiment of it that has really been useful, because both of those things could be of a lot of utility, right? Like, you want to have something that's somewhat spontaneous, because if you're trying to be creative, novelty is obviously a big factor here. And so you want to just sort of let yourself loose, but then you want to step back and say, okay, what's the next direction I'm going to take? And so it's really this piecemeal thing of like a bunch of, it's almost paradoxical, a bunch of like spontaneously things that are organized. I've always thought of it in terms of ordered disorder, I guess, or organized chaos or whatever. But it seems to map onto this, default mode, frontal parietal dynamic or exchange that goes on. Yeah.
That's interesting. I can say from what I've learned and sort of how I learned from the diagnosis literature and the clinical reasoning literature and what I teach and observation is like, I guess, as far as like I think you're asking about like observing something really systematically and methodically versus like in a more free-form way. And so I guess I'd start just by saying that observation itself is not just like observing one thing, but it's observing phenomena for their interrelationship with other things and like looking for the cause and effect of those phenomena. So that everybody is going to like, actually every single doctor would probably have a different pathway to like observing a patient. There might be like a shared common thing, but like what strikes one person as weird or remarkable or different or interesting or is going to vary by specialty, by that person's cultural upbringing, by like what they don't like. And so like sort of having a methodical way, like, yeah, I'd say like that's not really even possible so much as simply taking the time to look carefully. And then the other thing is that like there actually is literature on, is it more effective to like diagnose really intuitively based on your pattern recognition or through like mindful, careful analysis. And that's really interesting because that's super interesting stuff because like that pattern recognition is, especially with a very seasoned masterful clinician, is an incredible gift. They can make a diagnosis really quickly. And that's a great thing. Yet most diagnostic errors, like something like 92% of diagnostic errors, happen in a place of pattern recognition that's not double checked in a systematic way. So, this is another sort of common theme among like really great diagnostic teachers is they advocate for both. So having that space for the intuitive looking and then also mindful analysis or, having another colleague look at it.
Yeah, I think that intuitive form of thought is really helpful and can sort of great amount of function. But then if you're making decisions in this way, it's hard to explain how you reach that decision. And in this case, with the diagnosis, you can't explain how you reach the decision. That could definitely lead to some problems. Another question.
To that point, simply sharing your line of thought for how you got to this inference or diagnosis based on this one observation, like actually that's a really important strategy for teaching diagnosis and also for bringing patients along in understanding is like sharing that line of thought because it's not linear and it is like going to be really different for everybody, but that's the important good stuff. And going back to the visual thinking strategies methodology that I use in teaching. So one of the main questions with visual thinking strategies when you're looking at a work of art and somebody says something like, I'm actually going to make a comment on the work of art behind Paul. So it looks like that's a skull and it's angry. So the second question in visual thinking strategies is, what do you say? What do you see that makes you say that? So you ask that when somebody says something that's like interpretive. And I would say, well, I guess I see anger because of the red quality in the mouth and the way the gums are kind of growling. That makes me say anger. So somebody else might, so I'm sharing my line of thought. And so the importance of people doing that, like within a culture, is like incredibly helpful to having learning happen in that culture.
Really interesting. This is another question from the audience that I'll throw to Paul first. So what are your thoughts on how mindfulness plays into these processes with ambiguity and art?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not a practitioner of mindfulness. I mean, I've done some research on it. I find it actually makes me quite anxious, probably because I'm not very good at it. But also, I guess there's research suggesting that if you've got PTSD, that mindfulness can actually be quite bad. Whether I've got PTSD, I don't know. It's an open question. But in any case, for me, mindfulness isn't something that I've altogether loved. Nonetheless, I think really mindfulness is under the umbrella of getting into a flow state. And you can do it through mindfulness meditation, or you can do it through playing music, or you can do it through exercising or jogging or painting. For me, the easiest way to get into that meditative sort of state is to paint. You get the characteristic signals of being in a flow state, like complete immersion in what you're doing, to some extent, a loss of the sense of self, like a ego dissolution to some extent, loss of time where I'll paint for like 6 hours and it feels like 20 minutes have passed, sort of thing. So for those for whom mindfulness works well and is positive, I think it seems to be great and has a host of benefits, including, improved attention, mood, all sorts of things. But again, I think there are various different ways that one can accomplish that that ultimately is trying to get into a flow state. And I do it through painting and through music, but to each their own.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I would agree with that totally.
Yeah, so I want to be mindful of the time. Just have a couple minutes left, so I wanted to there are just a couple questions. There's a question for Alexa about the specific prompts that you use in your programs. He asked because they're wondering how you think those tasks or prompts could foster your broad level goals, being comfortable with uncertainty, etc.
Yeah, so I think you're asking about the visual thinking strategies methodology, which there's a lot out there. And if people want to be in touch, I'm also happy to send resources. But those questions are very carefully designed to create a learning, where a facilitator is creating a learning environment of constant questioning that's continually evidence-based. So it's what's happening here in this work of art. What do you see that makes you say that? And what more can you find? One of the things I talked about, question 2, what do you see that makes you say that? But question 3, what more can we find? What I love about that question is that the definition of curiosity is the assumption that there's always more to see. So it's a constant conditioning of just ongoing curiosity. Like, even though somebody might have said something and noticed something really great that casts a lot of meaning, that's great. What more can we find? And that actually connects beautifully to issues of diagnostic error. I mean, search satisficing error is one of the most common biases behind errors, where, like, somebody found something and then they stopped looking. So, like, the most commonly missed fracture in the emergency room medicine is the second fracture, right? There's so many cases of, like, somebody got bandaged up and then they went home and they came back 3 days later with 3 other broken bones, because somebody found something, they were done. So what more can we find? Conditions that, like, let's continue to see. I did actually want to ask Paul, you were talking about the flow state. What is it about, like, everyone, and this includes myself, but like everyone I know who's experienced the flow state athletically, in art, in meditation, it's like you kind of spend the rest of your life like trying to create ways to have the flow state. Yeah. And it's not easy in modern society. But what is it about the flow state that just, like, makes us just want to have it again? Neurologically.
I think it's just like it's a state. I mean, this ties into mind wandering theory, that we mind wander because we have current concerns that could be positive or negative. Like, could be financial concerns that are negative, or maybe you got a job interview and it's a more positive thing. But nevertheless, these things are more likely to come to mind and this is functional because then you think about them and hopefully come up with some plan of action. But it's draining to do all the time, right? Like, we get tired. Our attention can't be sustained for, well, some research suggests more than 4 hours without plateauing or decreasing. And so, yeah, to get into this state where, for me, a flow state is a state in which there aren't these current concerns. It's very in the moment, which is weird because there is this atemporal aspect to it insofar as you lose a sense of time. But really, it's just, it's this pleasant existence without worry, without concerns. And who wouldn't want that, you know? Yeah.
Very nice. Well, on that, a very, very soothing note, I think I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our guests very much for agreeing to be part of this. And thank you to everyone who signed on the call. If you're interested, if you enjoyed this event, you can find more information on our website and check us out on Twitter. So yeah, thank you everyone and have a great weekend.